interested in history, was always interested in this, and kind of like, well, I don't get it. Like, how can you have, because at the time I was growing up in the 60s, there was no black Congress people. Except Adam Clayton Powell, there was very few people. So you're like, wait a minute, how you going to have black people in the 1860s, 1870s being in Congress, but we don't have that now? And nobody in the school that I was in actually ever explained it. Brother Alomar.
Make a note, these were Republicans too.
Republicans, yeah.
My grandfather, great-grandfather was born in 1851, and my grandfather was born in 1877. My grandmother was born in 1876. So I have family, this part of my historical tribute, in the time frame that you were talking about in terms of the people. My grandfather, even my aunt today, the one that's 91 and quite ill, is a Republican. So they come to that because of Lincoln,
Because of Lincoln.
Reconstruction, because of slavery ending.
Exactly.
That became the way that they did things in the South. And my grandfather was not in the quote-unquote South, was in Missouri, but his father came from Virginia, where he escaped the plantation right during all that confusion.
Okay. So we'll hear more from Brother Alomar next week with his tribute, but he's right. Lincoln was a Republican. And it's not the same connotations associated with the Republican Party now. Black folks were, up until Roosevelt, pretty much, Franklin Roosevelt, pretty much were Republicans. And then Roosevelt, as a New Deal Democrat, came in office and basically, shifted things a bit in terms of our consciousness. And then there's another shift in the late 50s, early 60s, where the Dixiecrats, who were Southern Democrats, basically took over the Democratic Party. So even our political labels are somewhat fluid and shift.
Well, didn't they, wasn't there, they came to a point where they had so much influence on the Democratic Party, but since black people were moving to the Democratic Party so much and there was more liberal ideas coming in,
Right.
that they
Moved back
abandoned and went to the Republican
to
Party and
Republican.
took
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's who they are now.
Starting with Barry Goldwater
Yeah.
in 64, I think it was.
And there are a lot of older Africans that will still vote Republican out of
Just based on, yeah.
based on what they knew from before my
Yeah.
grandfather.
So what we'll call, let's call it by its name, white terrorists. Terrorism did not start with Al Qaeda and all. Terrorism started with the Ku Klux Klan. The definition of terrorism, if you look at that definition,
Yeah, actually, I got to say, terrorism started with the taking of land on this continent. I mean,
Well, that too.
I mean, that was
Yes,
terrorism.
yes.
The taking of
You're right.
African bodies to this nation was terrorism. I mean,
You're right.
this country was obviously founded on
Right.
terrorist principles.
exactly.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You're right.
And-
So
and
we
you
can
would-
say there's waves of terrorism. Right.
And you would use violence to attack, a small number, but you would use the tool of fear and terror to control and intimidate the rest, the larger body.
Body. So Ku Klux Klan started in Pulaski, Tennessee, in 1865. Oh man, when I was Googling this to get some images, like if you go to this one site that's like the current KuKluxKlan.com, like, yeah, it's www.kkk.com.
Wow.
It's there,
Oh yeah.
and it's deep because they say something like, "Attention, white citizens, there's a race war going on, white people," and then they say, "But we're not about violence. We're non-violent, and we want to bring about a change through non-violent means." It was like they took a page out of Dr. King's
Right.
speeches and dropped it in. And they got T-shirts. Like it was tripping me out. You got to go to this site just to understand some of the people that are out here in this country. They had T-shirts and logos and and they had one that was for kids, and it said, let's see, Kids Care Klan.
Ooh.
So it's like KKK for kids.
Right.
Yeah. Idioma Day. Like, let's go.
Yeah.
Right. So, but it was started as a social club initially by 6 Confederate veterans. In the beginning, it was a secret fraternity because Ku Klux was derived from the Greek word kuklos, which means circle or clan. Right. The costume was adopted by its members because at that time period disguises were quite common. It was a mask and a white robe and a high pointy head hat. According to the founders of the Klan, they had no malicious intent from the beginning, but that probably didn't last about a day. The Klan grew quickly and became a terrorist organization that attracted former Civil War generals such as Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you ever start a list of like enemies of the race, his name needs to be on there. Confederate general who didn't follow any rules of war. There was a famous battle at Fort Pillow. Black troops had been in the Union Army surrendered. because they were outnumbered, outgunned. They got them all together and murdered everybody. They didn't put them in prison camp, which is what happened to white soldiers. They massacred all the black soldiers. He was hated by black people. But in Memphis, Tennessee, he was lauded as a hero up until the 60s. I mean, I think there was schools named after him. Like, so again, knowing the history matters.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times this stuff it keeps living, right? So then the Klan spread beyond Tennessee to every state in the South, including mayors, judges, as well as sheriffs, as well as common criminals. In California, in 1920, there was a census done of the Klan. There were more Klan members in California than in Mississippi in 1920. In Oakland, there's images of, and you may have heard me say this before, there's images of Klan rallies, parades. Richmond, California in particular, 5,000 strong, marching through the streets of Richmond in full Klan regalia in the 30s.
Down McDonald.
Down McDonald.
Right down McDonald.
Right. And because they were going to originally march in Oakland, they got a permit, and then people thought second and said, no, y'all can't march here, so they moved up to Richmond. But they had a rally at the Oakland Convention Center right there across from Laney, and basically had a big rally where there was something like 4,000 Klan members, including kids, including women, and they were basically saying, like, this is our club, this is who we are. A couple of hands are up.
I just, you have the Birth of a Nation up there. I just want to, emphasize that was the first feature-length film made in America was the glorification of the beginning of the Klan.
Yeah.
The
first film.
And
First
it was
film.
the use of visual imagery to manipulate people's
Yeah,
minds.
right.
And consistent with what you were saying, one of the books that's for my research is Without Sanctuary, and it's images of lynching and a lot of the postcards that were sent, and it talks about the social aspects and culture and barbarism that's connected with the tradition of lynching. So I'll pass it around, but know that it's...
Yeah, there's some intense photographs in it, probably. Brother Alamine and then Brother Cater.
One of the major groups that they terrorized was the Catholics around Notre Dame, in Indiana. Did a lot of terrorizing of Catholics. And,
Okay. So Catholics, black folks, Jews, anybody other than Anglos. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Brother Cater.
Getting back to the Birth of a Nation, Woodrow Wilson, he was so excited about it after seeing, he called it was history written with lightning.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But just one point, the Ku Klux Klan, one of the founding members or founding leaders was, and I'm drawing a blank on his name, I got a book by him at home, but he was also the national head of the Masons at that time. And his family owned the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper. And his statue was in D.C. I think people were protesting it. If you go to any huge Scottish rite, they will usually have a bust of him. I can't remember his name right now.
Albert Pike.
There you go, Albert Pike. Thank you. But ironically, his newspaper just a few years ago was the very newspaper that broke the story on military spying on civil rights leaders, and that the fact that the Spingard had been one of the chief spies for the military spying on black people. His award in the NAACP is still the highest award given out.
And Pike also wrote the Dogma,
Morals and Dogma.
Morals and
I
Dogma,
have
which
that
is
as
like
well.
the Bible for the consistory in Masonry. He wrote the whole degree.
So again, something to pay attention to. This film had a powerful impact, as Tracy and others had mentioned, on American attitudes about black people. I remember when they were this is in the 70s, as a college student, they were still trying to show this film on Northwestern's campus. And they were saying, well, it's a piece of historical, it's an artifact, it's something people need to see. We was like, I don't need to see that again. Right? So we protested. It got shown anyway, and there was discussion groups after and all that. But it had powerful. I want to show an image, and if this bothers you, you may want to look away for a moment. This is an image of lynching. It's important that we know that so much of what happened was used in ways that that shifted attitude. And again, this connection between art and politics. This image of like 7 people being hung at the same time. This kind of image is probably what Billie Holiday saw when she wrote and performed Strange Fruit. A very haunting song. If you've never heard that song, find it on some audio library. There were, lynchings became public events. They would be advertised. Picnics.
Right,
Picnic.
that's right.
Yeah.
I say,
We stopped using that term a long time ago, around picnics, right? Public, celebration, and this intersection between Christianity and what they were about was very powerful in terms of this, and they used the whole rhetoric around to protect the sanctity of white women, and we don't want to be mongrelized, and all this stuff you see going right up until the 60s as an outward expression, right? Very quickly, Brother Alamine, I'm going to ask everybody to be brief, because we got really a lot to cover today.
My family was in Virginia. I plan to go visit there when I go back east. And, 7 members of their cousins
Wow.
over a white woman. One of them was dating, married woman. And that was the time they changed it. From that point, they changed the law in Virginia for the hanging. They stopped hanging for rape after that.
Oh, I'm
Sister
sorry.
Tracy did a historical tribute on the Scottsboro boys in Alabama. This was right after that in Virginia. So I'll be showing that photograph too.
With these pictures, I always study the people in the crowd, though,
Yeah.
more so, because
Yeah.
just, what is their state of mind, and considering that they've got children and grandchildren that are among us today.
Yeah, one of the people who took a note of this, and obviously Ida B. Wells Barnett was an important journalist who was reporting these stories, using the images. W.B. Du Bois talks about being a young man in Atlanta, and there having been a lynching, and that he was passing by on the street in front of a store, and looks into the store window, and he sees body parts that were being used to basically advertise a lynching that had happened. But this is the kind of barbarism that our folks got exerted to. And then you see all kinds of other images. It's notion of, like with the Freedmen's Bureau, people didn't like, white folks who didn't like it use images like, here's this lazy black person. It's interesting that we could ever be called lazy, as hard as we work, right? I mean, that's just, come on. But the lazy black man sitting there while the white man chops the wood, and they made it seem like, oh, all the black people just gonna sit around, and this is what they use to fight these images. Reconstruction, the Second Civil War is one author calls it, and so white folks had weapons. And the attitude, as you see in this one, this probably could be a little larger, he's carrying the Confederate flag on one side, and carrying the Klan banner on the other side, and it says, same war, different uniform, right? So much of this, but in spite of all this, you have interesting people. I love this photograph. This is from 1878. Sister was a soprano. She became the queen of staccato. So the first black artist to perform at the White House. And just her regalness, and I'm all that with a hat. Would be a great historical tribute topic. It's the first time I had heard of her when I was going through this, and many other people in the arts, right? People in business. William Shorey, who lived from 1859 to 1919. Late 19th century captain of whaling ships. He was known as the Black Ahab. Born in Barbados in 59, spent his life at sea. Became the only black captain operating on the west coast of the United States in the late 1800s and 1890s. And I believe was essentially a millionaire. Anybody know where he lived? West Oakland. Wow. Had a house in San Francisco and West Oakland. Ashe. So if you go in the city of Oakland, all these resources, right? City of Oakland Public Library has archive. And you see a lot of stuff about William Shorey. Be another interesting topic for a historical tribute.
are any streets here named after them?
I don't know. That's a good question. It would be nice if they were. Excuse
There's
me.
one in San Francisco after Lita Stewart, who was
Oh.
into shipping and
Right.
African American into
Right,
shipping.
right.
Yeah.
Came a little bit after Shorey, I think.
Yeah.
Dr. Robert Tanner Freeman was the first African American dentist to receive a degree in the United States. This is somebody that Dr. Bassett probably has heard about. He graduated from Harvard University Dental School in 1869. He and George Lewis Ruffin from the law school shared the first distinction of being the first African Americans to graduate from Harvard University. Except in my little research, I found there was another brother. And they recently found out about this man several years before either Tanner, or either Freeman or Ruffin. And unfortunately didn't pull that slide. But somebody was about to demolish a house in Chicago. And what they found was that he was more in the era of, I think it was Lincoln. And he had graduated from Harvard. He had become an ambassador to, like, someplace not an ambassador, but had diplomatic connections, I believe, to Russia. But again, our history is living, right? And this was relatively recent that someone found this information. I'll pull that information and send it to folks if you're interested. It's also the period of the beginning of many of our historically black colleges. So Tuskegee Institute, Porter Hall is the first building erected at Tuskegee Institute. We were very interested in education, very interested in a betterment of the race through education as a primary vehicle. Doing business like Shorey and others, starting insurance companies, starting cosmetology shops, all kinds of businesses that we were involved in the in that Reconstruction period, going further as you get closer to the turn of the century, turn of that century. So at the turn of the century, W.B. Du Bois was born in the late 1800s, and we'll see that several people were born in that time period. A really important book, and we'll look at this in a second, The Souls of Black Folk. If you've never read any parts of it, it's worth a read. It's the book that talks about the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. W.B. Du Bois wrote this masterpiece book in his 30s. He's like 33. Well, before he wrote the book, he did the first sociological study in the United States or anywhere on black people. It was the Philadelphia study. And so he kind of looked at the condition of black people in Philadelphia. So he's really the first black sociologist. And some people say he created the science of sociology, essentially. But he wrote that when he was in his late 20s, early 30s. Du Bois is worth studying. He just had an interesting life. He lived a long time. And then he's doing all this in the context of the Niagara movement, which is the precursor to much of the NAACP, the Atlanta race riots, and a whole period, what we'll call Red Summer, of race riots, the Brownsville affair, where several veterans were discharged after almost 20 years of service in Brownsville, Texas, over an incident that happened there. Teddy Roosevelt, who black people had supported for the presidency, people had gone to him and said, can you commute their sentences? He refused to. Politics as usual, right? So you see this sort of timeline from 1900 up until the 1920s, which gets us into, and you see Red Summer, gets us into starting to be right in that transition of the Harlem Renaissance. So Red Summer was this period where there was just lynchings and race riots all over the country. East St. Louis, Chicago, New York, Elaine, Arkansas, San Francisco. There were places all over the country where these race riots happened, and we had great tribute, 2 weeks ago? Tulsa race riots in Oklahoma. This was in East St. Louis. I think this is also East St. Louis. Springfield, Illinois. But there are several places around the country where dozens of American cities were torn apart. And they call them race riots, but they really should call them white people riots. Because it was basically white folks attacking us. We didn't riot. It was usually we getting attacked and we're fighting back. So it kind of implies somehow that we went off like the Watts riots or Detroit, where that was us, like instigating, But even that, you could probably argue that it was a response to the National Guard. It was just part of in response to COINTELPRO. So if we say the 1920s, the Tulsa riot is a marker, and then the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression, it moves on through that era into the 30s. But just a few images around segregation. The Jim Crow laws basically created segregation in transportation, so separate waiting rooms, for instance, in bus stations and train stations. And this is not to say that people hadn't challenged some of these laws in an earlier period. Ivy Wells Burnett, for instance, paid a full fare on a train and was basically tried to throw her off the train when they crossed the Mason-Dixon line. And she sued and eventually won her case. So people were always, and the same thing happened in Philadelphia on a streetcar. African-American leaders there fought it. So we were always resisting. It wasn't just during the modern civil rights movement that we began to push back against some of this. Even this one, we watched for white people only. So if you go through your life seeing all these signs, all these indicators of how black folks shouldn't be part of the society, is what our ancestors had to deal with. In Harlem, they did very creative protests. This was a march in Harlem, and they did one of the most famous marches in Harlem was in the 20s, where it was a silent march. After a set of lynchings and race riots had happened, all these black folks got in the streets and were dressed and didn't speak anything and just walked up the street and had symbols and signs. And this one, it says, "Here lies Jim Crow." And so they dressed up as if it was a funeral and carried a coffin through the streets of Harlem saying, we're ready for Jim Crow to be dead. All the way up until the Memphis period where Dr. King was killed in Memphis over the sanitation workers. Their signs often had to do with Jim Crow, I am a man, and you see two sides of this. The presence of segregation is the absence of democracy. Jim Crow must go. And then a white guy walking around with a sign saying, support the merchants who support segregation. So this is you know in
dichotomy.
focus, right? And there's a song that we used to sing, "Which side are you on, brother? Which side are you on?" I'm on the freedom side. You know, that in the music you get to see, you know, some of what people were doing. You had people like, and this is an interesting transition after Reconstruction. A lot of the people that we associate with the Harlem Renaissance and this modern civil rights movement were born in the late 1800s. So you have to remember that their parents' generation would have been enslaved Africans or freed people in the society before the end of the Civil War. So they were coming out of these experiences of having real experiences of what the stories they must have heard from their grandparents and their parents about slavery. Okay, Brother Alman.
Yeah, my mother was thrown off the bus when it went past the Mason-Dixon line when she went to visit my father at the military base in North Carolina. And she had gotten arrested because of that.
Yeah. So here's another person. There's so many personalities in our history, especially here in North America. And again, most of what I got for you today is from the United States. Didn't cover Brazil very well, as we talked about last week. Other places around the world, so it leaves a lot of room to figure out, well, what was happening in other parts of the world? Colonialism was beginning to pick up steam in the late 1800s after the Berlin Conference. Belgium goes into the Congo right at the turn of the century. So all of these folks are being born. 1895, if you never heard of Charles Hamilton Houston, do a little bit of research. Charles Houston is one of the most important legal minds of the 20th century. He was someone who trained a whole generation of lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall and others, who pursued the rights in the legal system. He was the dean of the Howard University Law School, and this is also a story about taking care of ourselves. Charles Hamilton Houston literally worked himself to death. Literally.
Yes.
He worked day and night for you and for me. His doctor told him, he had some kind of heart condition. His doctor told him, if you don't slow down, you're going to be dead within 5 years. Houston died, I think, was age 55.
Yeah.
55 years old. We're going to sort of see the roots of repatriation movements, back to Africa movements. We talked last week about Martin Delany. So in 1854, he leads a national immigration convention in Cleveland, Ohio, and his manifesto was called "The Political Destiny of the Colored Race on the American Continent." And he said, as men and equals, we demand every political right, privilege, and position to which the whites are eligible in the United States, and we will either attain to these or accept nothing. There was and you know, because of the times, it didn't include women in there. It should have included women, but there were a significant number of women attendees who also voted for the resolution, considered by many to be the foundation of black nationalism. The first statement of, in a public way, if we can't get what we were supposed to get here, we will go. He supported migration to Liberia as early as 1859, before the Civil War. It's on the eve of the Civil War. Delany, and following what Cuffey had done a few years before, Paul Cuffey had taken a ship of folks to Liberia. I think it was 38 people who went to Liberia with Cuffey. So that was always an inclination. Like, can we figure out a way to reconnect with brothers and sisters there? And it's a complicated history. The Liberians, many of the African Americans who went to Liberia went as like the elites and treated the Liberians, the indigenous Liberians, very poorly up until 1980.
Yes.
So the Liberian Civil War was based on this dynamic. It's complicated history, right? We do some things that aren't necessarily what we should be doing. Image of Cuffey, image of Henry McNeil Turner, who was also part of a repatriation idea. And this was the map of Liberia. Sierra Leone was also part of that same dynamic. Cuffey was taking folks, I think, to Sierra Leone. Henry McNeil Turner, who was an AME bishop and politician, was, I think, pushing people to go to Liberia.
Why Liberia? I'm trying to remember that.
You know, it's a good question. It was sort of considered like an easy place to settle. It was close, you know. So in terms of distance from, say, New York or Baltimore, getting there, there must have been some other features to it, though,
Yeah.
too. And I don't quite remember another topic, you know, begging to be explored, right?
What colonial country had power over Liberia?
Yeah.
You know, that
That might have been, and that might have been the thing. May have been nobody.
Exactly.
And the U.S. government might have said, "Hey, the English aren't here, the French aren't here, Portuguese aren't here.
Right.
It looks like a
We
free."
don't have any
Right, we're not
interest,
competing with
financial
another
Not
colonial
competing
power.
anything,
Yes.
which probably speaks to what are the raw materials and resources there too. It would
Right.
probably
But they
be
initially
rubber.
had problems with the indigenous people,
Right.
because they had to make several trips, and then they finally went in with force and.
The Americans did.
The Americans went in with force
American
and
government.
took the land.
Okay.
And something interesting that I found in going through the homework, the Liberians, the population of Liberia now is only 5% of descendants from America.
Okay. So the numbers
Still-
have
right.
diminished.
But I think property had been set aside in Liberia for repatriation of Africans in the diaspora who had been freed. There's also an area just.
Set
up-
aside by the American, U.S. government,
I'm
or
not
by?
sure, I can't remember who set it up, but it was like a free colony.
Okay.
So that's why so many people migrated to Liberia. And then there's an area just on the northern part of Canada. It's almost like a little island.
Like Nova
where
Scotia
free-
is,
Nova Scotia, right.
yeah.
Where free people were allowed to
Okay.
repatriate.
And there's a lot of interesting history
And they
around
had
this.
ships going back and forth.
A lot of interesting history around all of this, as we say, because we have, parts of this history. The repatriation idea to sort of get rid of the black people because we were a problem, so to speak, that started with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the first person to propose that the way to solve this problem was to send black folks home. All right, Abraham Lincoln had proposed Haiti. So there's a lot of, proposals about, quote, what to do with these problem folk. So as we moved on through this, there were sort of always multiple strands of African freedom movement. I think it'd be a great idea for us to get out of this sort of Western thought of it was either Booker T or Du Bois.
Yes.
It was either Malcolm or Martin. It was always this either or thing that we do, when it's really, everybody has the same ends in mind, a different way of getting there. Yes,
The
quickly.
understudy of Booker T was Nathan B. Young, and he was very literate in the moral land grant, and he would write grants, and they would get $5,000 way back in 1875 to start colleges.
Okay. So the education piece, there were, as you say, friends of the race, and I'm sure that some of that was not as friendly as maybe we think it was, but it was the idea that we'll put money into Booker T and because we designate him as the leader, right? So Carnegie, Rosenberg, or Rosenwald, all these wealthy Americans who thought they were sort of helping solve the problem were giving Booker T a lot of resources to do what he was doing. And he's an interesting figure. Complex person, right? Born in 1856, so he's born before the end of slavery, lives until 1915, so he lived through the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, the reversals of Reconstruction, the right at the beginning of the lynchings that were happening, and he too died pretty young. I think it was what? That's 50, makes him 50. Let's see, 40. He's about 56.
64.
Yeah, a high stress job, right, or whatever. His biography has become a classic up from slavery. It was the inspiration for Garvey, but there were other folks like Du Bois and Hubert Henry Harrison who wrote counter narratives. There was always people writing counter narratives. When Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in the mid 1800s, Martin Delany, who we saw in another context, wrote a book called Blake, or The Huts of America, because he felt like the portrayal of Africans in Uncle Tom's Cabin was too passive, it was too weak, and so he wrote an alternative and said, no, this is from a black person's point of view, not Harry Beecher Stowe, but from a black person's point of view, here's what was really happening. He's the founder of Tuskegee Institute, big croppers on that. He was the founder of the National Negro Business League. He was complicated by his politics of control, because if you became an enemy of him, like Hubert Henry Harrison did, he tried to destroy you. Because he had such a network of influence and money that Henry Harrison worked at the post office in New York at the time. He calls his friend, who is his boss, and his boss's boss, and says, y'all got to get rid of Harrison. Because Harrison wrote a critique of the stuff that the Atlanta Compromise that Booker T. Washington didn't like. The Atlanta Compromise basically came at a time where Washington stands up, he's got all of this white support, and he says, look, we won't agitate, we won't protest, we don't want our rights to vote or any of that. We want to basically learn industrial sciences and agriculture and mechanics, whatever those things are, so we can earn the right to vote. And of course, there was another part of the conversation going like, we don't need to earn that, we already did. We're American citizens, that's what the 13, 14, 15 amendments was about. Why should we have to earn this? And so Booker T created a lot of enemies in the race after he gave that speech. White folks loved him even more, right? All right, so the person who I think is one of the most forgotten people in our history in the 20th century is this man, Hubert Henry Harrison. Born in St. Croix, came here at 19 years old as an orphan, and basically become one of the most important intellectual leaders and activists in our history. He is rarely talked about, partly in part because he was an early socialist. But then he brokered the socialists over their views around race and labor. They kept saying class first, and he was saying, no, race matters because we can't even join labor unions because of the racism that's there. Harrison was born in 1883, so he was an elder to many of the people who came through the Harlem Renaissance. As Brother Shango mentioned last week, the new Negro manhood movement, this was coined by Hubert Henry Harrison. It becomes the basis for black pride, the Renaissance in art, the Renaissance in business, all of that. Harrison is part of a secret society early on called African Blood Brotherhood. They were trying to organize themselves to defend themselves against the lynchings that were happening. There's a lot going on with Harrison. He started the Colored Socialist Club. He started the Liberty League. Anybody who knows the history of the UNIA knows that in the full name of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and it's like, and the Liberty Leagues of the world, or something like that. So Harrison was the pioneer of many of these ideas. He wrote a book called When Africa Awakes. If you're interested in Harrison, there's a great Hubert Henry Harrison reader that has articles that he wrote. He wrote for the New York Times. He was a theater critic. So when plays would go up on Broadway, he would write, critiques of those plays. He was a bibliophile. Many of his books. He was a friend of Arturo Schomburg, who was Afro-Puerto Rican, who we know from the Schomburg Collection and Schomburg Library. He was one of the people that donated books to Schomburg. So many of Hubert Henry Harrison's books were in the Schomburg. Yes.
And he was another atheist, too.
He was an atheist. He was a humanist. He was an interesting person. He had the largest collection of erotica, books around eroticism in Harlem. So people are always trying to hook up with Henry Harrison. Hubert Henry Harrison. He was a soapbox speaker. So that famous thing that we see Malcolm X doing, all kinds of folks that were on soapboxes literally in Harlem to give speeches. This said in J.A. Rogers' World's Great Men of Color, Hubert Henry Harrison gave a lunchtime talk on Wall Street that 10,000 people came to.
Wow.
He's the person who gave the first opportunity to speak in Harlem to Marcus Garvey. He invited Marcus Garvey to his meeting. Garvey shows up, and Garvey was not a good speaker at that time. Garvey got much better, right? Garvey literally fell off the stage when he was done. And people thought, well, that's the end of that. We don't see this dude no more. But Garvey was a younger person, and Harrison was a mentor to so many people. He is worth studying. He talks about education. He distinguishes between education and schooling. He says what happens in schools is one thing. What happens, he was self-trained. He was what they call an autodidactic. So he trained himself. He was the most well-read person of his generation. He could talk about economics, anthropology, sociology, religion, psychology, music, art, theater. He read voraciously. Yes.
What was that word again?
Autodidactic.
Autodidactic.
Yeah. Autodidactic, I think. D-A-T-I.
The didactic means intended to instruct or
All right. Another great mind for the race, W.B. Du Bois. And if you see, Du Bois is, let's see, so 1883. Actually, Du Bois is a little bit older than Hubert Harrison. He was born in 1868, lived until 1963. 95. I think he was 95 years old. If I did the math right. And Du Bois actually died. It was either on the same day or within a 24-hour period of March on Washington. It was a really interesting kind of transitional moment in history. He died in Ghana. He died after going to Ghana. He wrote Souls of Black Folk in 1903. We still talk about the double consciousness of Africans in America. Having to be African on one hand, having to be American on the other hand, and the sort of problems and challenges that creates. And at the same time, he thought that double consciousness was an asset. He said, henceforth, the destiny of the race could be conceived as leading neither to assimilation nor separatism, but to proud, enduring hyphenation. Hyphenation is kind of interesting. So African-American, right? Like Irish-American, Italian-American, Chinese-American, whatever, that hyphenation piece. He vehemently opposed the Atlanta Compromise. He opposed Marcus Garvey and lived to regret it. He was among the group of folks, including Harrison, who ultimately saw Garvey as not as serious about getting things done, and there was a lot of problems with UNIA around the Black Star Line and all the investments and taking the money. Garvey seems to be an innocent in it, but had people around him who were really, some of whom were really dishonest, who took advantage of his inexperience in business. If Marcus Garvey had surrounded himself with people who really knew business, no telling where we would be right now.
Or if he had the support of Dubois instead of the opposition.
Well, here's the thing. When you read the history closely, they gave him a fair hearing in the early parts of it. But it was a period where there was a lot of charlatans who were collecting money. People like Father Divine. People like, who were taking money from black folks. So it's some good biographies about this. If you read them closely, the first few years, they all wanted to help. Hubert Henry Harrison was the first editor of Negro World newspaper, which was the basic news vehicle for the movement. You're right, but it's a question of unity, and it's always two sides of it. Garvey had a big ego. Big. But, that bigness is what made him great. He was like, we're going to have ships. We're going to have businesses. If he was a small thinker, and you're right, Du Bois, someone were jealous.
Yeah, at that time, they thrown in together, we'd be 50 years ahead instead of fighting the same struggles that we're fighting now.
Right. Well, here's the thing, and it's a rhetorical question. Why is it that we don't have unity in this Oakland community with folks who don't think like us? We ain't unified with no Christian brothers and sisters or our Muslim brothers and sisters or doing anything. It's a question, right? I mean, we have some of that unity. We meet with Minister Keith Muhammad and stuff, but it's kind of the same dynamic. And we somehow, black folks, got to get past it. He migrated to Ghana at Kwame Nkrumah's invitation in the late 50s, early 60s, and died there.
I visited his grave
The gravesite.
Yeah, same here.
The YGB group, the brother Davis and his son and wife have been leading. They led that delegation last summer. The kids actually did poetry at Du Bois' gravesite.
Well, it's actually a center there. It's not just a
It's
group.
a center.
It's a center, it's a library, it's a research center. It's well respected.
Correct. All right. So if we say from the 30s into the 50s, and we'll go back and see some more personalities from the Harlem Renaissance, but the March on Washington, the first March on Washington was planned in the 40s as a response to segregation in the military and in government services. That A. Philip Randolph, who was one of those people that shows up a lot in our history. First as a socialist with Cyril Briggs, then as a union leader with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He and C.L. Dellums created that as the first union for African Americans. C.L. Dellums working here in Oakland, A. Phil Randolph working in New York. And then some of the important cases, we got Jackie Robinson, who came out of baseball and played for a few years, I think, in the Negro Leagues. But then was the person that got picked and pulled out, unlike some of the other players, to break the color barrier in professional sports after African Americans had really revolutionized baseball in the United States. We're the ones that created night baseball games. And the way they did this was that they put generator and big poles and lights on a truck, and they would travel and they'd set up these lights so they could have night baseball. So a lot of innovations, and we were the best baseball players. And that's how that goes, right? All right. So if we go forward with this, a few personalities, as we wind this down from the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, who many will say is sort of the voice of the Harlem Renaissance. Jacob Lawrence, amazing visual artist who was able to present many ideas from his generation in the form of that art. This image from Claude Clark. And I'm gonna have one slide in here about Claude Clark. Claude Clark lived the end of his life here in Oakland.
Sure did.
Sister Daima Clark, his wife, was very active in ASCAC. His son, Claude Clark, who's another artist, has made an offer to us around putting some of his father's art here. We should take advantage of that offer. People like Duke Ellington, who were great musicians. One of the most important poets of that period, Claude McKay, who was from Jamaica. Many of you have heard that poem, If We Must Die. Let it not be like hogs, slaughtered at the pen. I don't know the entire poem, but when people read that poem, it had an effect on folks. Folks began to move a conversation. Zora Neale Hurston, 1891 to 1960, folklorist, novelist, author, most famous book, The Eyes Are Watching God. She was someone who was very proud of being African American, grew up in Eatonville, Florida, had no problems with being black. She said, I'm not some, and again, a great quote. She basically says, I'm not some suffering person. She's like, I like being black. Because she had grown up with black teachers, black doctors, black everything in her town. So she didn't feel like she was something less than because of what white folks were saying. Claude Clark again, 1915 to 2001. This is Mr. Clark. One of his paintings is called Slave Lynching, but the artists of the Renaissance were using political imagery, if you will, socio-political imagery to move the consciousness of the race, to move us to a greater peace. One of our preeminent historians, John Henry Clark, you know him. You know what he said about us. He said, a powerful people cannot afford to educate the people they oppress. Because once you are truly educated, you will not ask for power, you will take it. Dr. Clark was part of the Harlem Renaissance. Born in 1915, participated in the Harlem Writers Workshop as a poet. A lot of people don't know that early on. He said, history is not everything, but it's a starting point. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on a map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. Okay. Let me hold comments for a minute. We only got a few minutes, and I'm going to try to get through this, and we'll take a couple questions at the end. Ella Jo Baker, another person who needs to be taught, studied, learned from. Ella Baker's career spans being a socialist who organized food co-ops in Harlem in the 20s, to being the major field organizer for the NAACP during the 40s and 50s. She goes into the South as a person by herself, making connections with folks, establishing NAACP chapters. She's the first executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where Dr. King was the leader, but she was the manager. She was constantly doing that. She was an advisor to Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, Diane Nash, and others who started SNCC. So Ella Baker, I don't know if Brother Bridgeford ever met Ella Baker, but Ella Baker was one of those people that, like September Clark and others, who were really working with young people and trying to encourage them to be in leadership roles. She is all called, her nickname is Fundi, which means teacher in Kiswahili. A. Philip Randolph, who we referenced earlier, long career, ended up working with Bayard Rustin, who helped organize the March on Washington, the second March on Washington in 1963. Had a long career. Paul Robeson. You could talk about Paul Robeson forever in terms of his accomplishments. He was an actor. He was an All-American football player. He was a graduate of Columbia Law School. He was a singer of folkloric music, could sing in 36 languages. Paul Robeson was a multi-genius who said, I am an African. If you go back and read what he said about himself, he claimed his Africanness. He didn't say African American. He didn't say Anglo-American. He didn't say Afro-Saxon. He didn't say colored. He said, I'm African. All right, and we know what happened with him in terms of political persecution with the period of McCarthy. Lost his passport in 1952. Paul Robeson was the highest paid entertainer in the world. In the world.
He was a Rhodes Scholar.
Rhodes, I don't know if he's a Rhodes Scholar or not.
Yeah.
He's a Rhodes Scholar as well, which they should change the name of that.
Yeah.
Bad name,
Right.
after Cecil Rhodes, who was one of the most oppressed people in the history of Southern Africa, in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. But Robeson was essentially one of the best and the brightest of his generation, and died in 1976, almost forgotten. Almost forgotten. Bessie Smith, artist, was in the blues, laid a foundation for many of the jazz singers like Billie Holiday and others who came through Harlem. Josephine Baker, another icon of the era, had to go to Paris to really fully do her art. Was born in East St. Louis or St. Louis? Born in St. Louis, influenced Katherine Dunham and a whole generation of dancers. Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote Raisin in the Sun, wrote Raisin in the Sun before she was 30. Died relatively young, was a chain smoker, but made an amazing contribution in a really short period of time. One more round on Charles Hamilton Houston, who trained a generation of lawyers starting in the 20s that led to Brown versus Board of Education. He died in 1950, I think, before Brown was even argued. So his work outlived him, right? All right. Then we can talk about the Great Migrations. As I go through these last couple slides really quickly. The migration of African people from the southern United States into the Midwest, the East, Northeast, and California. The Subject of the Warmth of Other Suns, a great book, an excellent book by Isabel Wilkerson. If you haven't picked it up, but we were coming through train stations like the train station in West Oakland. That was one of the spots where we ended up because the train lines, as you see, run through the middle of the country as well as through the southern part of the country. So where you ended up had a lot to do with where train lines ran. A few images from that period. People were like, just pack it up. We got to go. Sometimes you can be very public about it, but often our ancestors had to do it in the middle of the night because they so-called sharecroppers were saying, owners were saying, you owe me money because every year you sort of owe me money. And we know the math is bad, and that's part of why many of us wanted to get our education so we could fight with that. But a lot of times people had to secret themselves out in the middle of the night to go start a new life. 6 million people between 1910 and 1970 moved from the southern United States into the north, the east, and the west.
One point about that book is that the whites recognized how it affected the economy, and that loss
Right.
of labor they did not want to happen. That's why they had another reason they had to sneak
And
out.
there was a period where black newspapers like the Chicago Defender had advertisements about come north and work in the factories, and then white folks countered that with their own articles and southern newspapers saying how terrible it was in Chicago, how terrible it was in New York, you don't want to go there. And some people stayed. Like my mother's generation, 4 of her siblings left. She stayed in Arkansas. So there's a narrative about folks who stayed, who hung in there, who created lives, despite Jim Crow, and many of whom were involved in the civil rights movement. During the same period, we have going from the colonial period to independence. In 1914, by this map, you can kind of see the parts of Africa that had been carved up and where people were. And it's interesting, we asked the question about Liberia. It's called independent in 1914.
Right.
So you kind of see it's an easier place to get to than, say, Angola or even Guinea. But these are the places, so French West Africa, the Sahel region, which is mostly desert, was controlled by France. They have Senegal, and Gambia is a little finger inside Senegal. But you can kind of see how the continent was carved up and who was controlling what. A whole generation of leadership, Nkrumah, Sékou Touré, Jomo Kenyatta, Nyerere, and others, who became educated all around the same time, many times outside of their countries, either in London or here in the United States. Nkrumah went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, but they got their educations and made connections that they then used later. So connections to Du Bois, connections to John Henry Clark, connections to Malcolm X, connections that were being made throughout that period. Sometimes independence came at the point of a gun, like in Guinea-Bissau. Sometimes it came through negotiations, but folks were very serious, and it impacted folks here because we began to see, as independence began, starting in 1949 in the purple areas, and moving all the way into 1980, which is Zimbabwe and Angola. Those are relatively late, but we were moving forward while black nationalism and civil rights movement were taking root here. So Garvey, an important figure, Amy Jacques Garvey is a leader in that movement, along with Marcus Garvey, this international convention that happened in 1922, I believe. Du Bois and others had done an international conference on the status of African people and earlier than that. So we're always meeting, conferring, planning, trying to figure out what to do. The Black Star Line, the investments that went into the Black Star Line, where they bought 3 ships. The ships began to take voyages, had a lot of financial problems. But it was very inspiring to black people to see this kind of forward movement. It influenced people like Elijah Muhammad, an early Garveyite. It influenced Malcolm X through his parents. Both his parents were Garveyites. Both wrote for the Negro World newspaper. Influenced people like Queen Mother Moore. Queen Mother Moore came to Wose in 1987-ish when we wrote on Galindo, and she died when she was in her 90s, I think. But Queen Mother Moore from New York was one of those people that always pushed African nationalism in our community. Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, the Freedom Riders, Dr. King, and this image is interesting. I had not seen that Coretta King was actually standing there while he's being handled roughly, and just from a personal kind of place, because a lot of times that picture is cropped, but you see they're in their 20s. Dealing with the brutality of the South and all these police stations. People like Bayard Rustin, who became an advisor to the movement, who was a pacifist, he grew up in a Quaker community, but he, one of the few people, like almost the only person, who debated Malcolm X and by all accounts won.
Wow.
His verbal and oratorical skills and command information was incredible too. And they debated, I think, twice. So Rustin is no joke. Very complicated person as well, openly gay, was someone who at the end of his life got very conservative, and it's not clear if he had some mental health issues, but it was something going on with Rustin in the latter part of his life, but one of the most amazing people at the height of his work. A generation that inspired folks that happened at Merritt College on Grove Street, Black Panther Party. Across the street was Black Panther Party office. So you had folks like Huey P. Newton, who was legendary in West Oakland. They had weapons for self-defense. They believed in, they had a 10-point plan, but they also had a school where children were learning right here on the International and 50, in the 50s, right? They had a free lunch program. It was the first free lunch program in the United States.
Yes.
U.S. Department of Agriculture patterned their free lunch program after the Black Panther Party.
Head Start was patterned.
Head Start was patterned after the Black Panther Party. And I will have to say, when you read Elaine Brown's biography, a lot of times we credit the brothers with all this. It's the women who were doing the hard organizing of school, legal clinic, all that. Brothers out here being like, so there's some issues of, gender up in there, because a lot of when they were exiled or jailed or put away, a lot of times it was left with the sisters to keep organizing. Right. There's a lot of complicated history with that. We know that the imagery, as Sister Tracy's talking about Afro, Angela Davis and others. One of our best and brightest who got murdered in his bed is Fred Hampton in Chicago. COINTELPRO was a conscious effort to kill folks. Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, moved
Came
to
to Wose.
Came to Wose. Another person came to Wose. Lived in Guinea in the last parts of his life. I went to Guinea once in the 90s. Before he had passed away, and his brother I met was like, on a Sunday, we're going to go have a nice outing at the beach, we're going to hang out, and I want you to meet this brother named Kwame. And I was like, oh, cool. So we get to the beach, and he's like introducing me to Kwame Ture. And I was just like, you could have told me, it's like any old brother named Kwame, right? So, very nice man. At that point in his life, very peaceful, liked having a good time, but would also talk to you about what was going on. Robert Williams and his wife, whose first name I can't remember, who broke with the nonviolent piece, were part of NAACP. Deacons of Defense is what they became, and pushed some things. So, last thing, Dr. King challenged us around community chaos. We have to look closely at our community now. Like, what do we have to do? What does our generation have to do to create community? What do we have to do to advance the plight of our folks? And who's up next? YGB. There's a lot of young people out here who are doing amazing work. They're using the arts. They're talking about their ancestors. They're doing not only Langston Hughes and Du Bois' work, but they're doing original work. There's lots of people around the country who are looking for leadership. This week I spent in 2 sets of meetings. One was with the National League of Cities, and I was asked to actually do a libation. So when I did a libation in front of 40 people from around the country, y'all have to know that when we go out in the world and do this, people are hungry for their culture. They're hungry for the history. All day. Every time somebody says something, somebody like this, Ashe. It's like Ashe. They were overusing. And I know we've made a couple changes in our piece, but put Ashe on the end of that. This libation is for you. Ashe. It's created a tradition. So there were people in that room who never seen libation before. And again, at the end of the day, they didn't remember a lot of other stuff, but it was like, Ashe, brother, Ashe. It was like, okay, all right. Y'all figure this out. Brother Davis.
That's an Ileoma that graduated on the left. My granddaughter took care of it. Ileoma.
Ileoma Day. And you got a whole bunch of them out there in the world doing stuff, right? This has been a great 6 weeks. We got to stop. Ask a quick question.
Where did Ivan Van Sertiman come in?
Oh, there's lots of people that come in that we couldn't do. Priscilla Dungy Houston, Doris Jim James, Obinga, Sheikh Anta Joe. There's so many people that we could have talked about. So as we close this out, I'm going to encourage you, take the history, use the history, teach younger people. Make sure that you do a good historical trivia on something so when people hear it, they go like, yeah, I want to know more about the tall black people. I want to hear more about, who is black. All of the topics that we have. This has been great 6 weeks. You got one last question and then we're done. I'll take these 2 and then we're done. We're over time by 15 minutes. Yes.
Do you burn any of your information so that we can do historical tributes based on what you shared in your class?
Yeah. Brother Cinnabar posted some of this on the website, on the live stream, and I'm going to give him the updated version of this, and you can feel free to use these slides, build off of them, use however. Okay.
Just real quickly, back to Jim Crow. If we look at the bare bones definition of Jim Crow as having separate rules for black and white, I think that would deal with this little controversy they're having at KPFA with Brother JR raised the issue that they were treating the black people there like it was Jim Crow. And he came under some criticism from other black people who were saying that, well, you know, this is nothing like Jim Crow. That's not a valid argument.
Right.
But if you stick with it, like I said, the bare bones definition.
Thank you all very much. It's been great having you in class. I've enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. We'll start the service momentarily.
Brother Greg.
Yes, sir.
Tomorrow I'm supposed to interview to have a young men's, I do it. I'm supposed to lead the class. I mean,
No.